Welcome to the second part of our lecture on the sources of politics and government. A consideration that we must keep in mind is that we have a record, a sort of historical record, if you will, of politics and government and how they've evolved. The reality is that human experience is a fact. All the social science disciplines use the past, what we might call history, although my favorite joke to the historians is that history is, after all, a dead subject. Uh, Politics is a living one. And that's not altogether true, but it gives me a chance to give historians and students in history a hard time. The past is very helpful in our study of political institutions and politics, how they've worked, how they've not worked, how we can improve them for the future. But history can't be our only guide, as we've discussed earlier. Um, the nature of politics is, for the most part, the nature of humankind. We change our views. A great example of this is political polling. And to give you a practical, real world example of that, is that very early in any presidential administration, a president will rate very high in the polls, but then the longer he stays in office, and someday I suspect in your lifetime you will see a she in the American presidency, that approval rating goes down. A famous example was in the early 90s, specifically in 1991, President George H.W. Bush, um, what we call Bush 41 sometimes, given that he is the second repeat uh, son, father-son presidential team in American political life. Of course, John Adams and John Quincy Adams in the early republic being the first example of that. Bush 41 was engaged, of course, in stopping Saddam Hussein's movement into Kuwait, and we call that oftentimes the first Gulf War. His his approval rating was in the 90s. I mean, just imagine what it would be like to go around campus or around your community with a 90 plus percent approval rating. It was amazing, exciting. I mean, if you're on a roll, but his approval rating decreased. In fact, it decreased to such a degree that in his effort to be reelected in 1992, he failed, and William Jefferson Clinton was elected president. You can see this in almost any presidential cycle. President Obama's ratings have decreased considerably from when he took office to now towards the end of his first term. And this is the case with almost any president. And so reality is why history is helpful. One of the reasons politics is such an exciting and necessary field of study is things change. And part of the political system, part of the call of politics, particularly in democratic life, is to adjust to that. Okay, let's talk about political principles. And we're going to talk about this more at a later point in the course, but what's the purpose of the state and what should the state attempt to achieve? One thing that political scientists assume when we study politics is human rationality, that people will use reason to make decisions that benefit themselves and potentially benefit what we call the common good, the larger community. And we use science to help us make those kinds of decisions. Keep in mind that when we talked about politics, we talked about politics as a process, government as the institutions where that process takes place. We also need to keep in mind that they are not just American systems of politics and of institutions, but they're international versions as well. Every country in the world has some system of politics and government. Another aspect of the source of politics is to realize that there is a constitution, a law underpinning our system of government that helps define areas of activity, how we make decisions, things that the government cannot do, sort of protects the people from the government. Later on in the semester, we're going to talk about civil rights and civil liberties as an example of that. But the government's policy is to make decisions. We call those indeed the policy process. Well, what are some of the functions of political thinking? One of those that tells us why we did things in the past, mistakes we made in the past, and how we can improve those. Another function of political thinking is to help us work our way through those most critical issues that face the country, whether it be national defense, national security, the defense of our borders, uh, providing a social welfare net for our most needy citizens, um, the infrastructure, parks, those kinds of things, almost any kind of topic, are we think politically to help us resolve those problems in the here and now, in the present. And from a citizenship perspective, we study politics so that we as a citizen, our citizens, can be better informed, can then go out and make a difference in the world and try to make our country a better place. So political thinking is both useful, worthwhile, and necessary for us to persevere as a country. A question that I introduced in the first part of this lecture is one that you need to consider for the remainder of this course. How does politics affect me? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to posit early on that politics affects you in almost everything you do. There's no part of our lives that is beyond the purview or influence of politics. That is a reality. As painful as it might be, as exciting as it might be, as bewildering perhaps as it might be, we need to face that. As you know already, when you work, taxes are taken out of your paycheck. The taxes, of course, go to support the work of the government. But it's much more involved, much more dramatic than that. Again, almost every aspect of your life is regulated by the government in some regard. Government affects our physical well-being as well. Government regulates for the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States air quality. Government regulates many aspects, water quality, building standards, the construction standards for buildings. There are many areas, and I'm just touching upon these that are so vital to everyday life. Car emissions, so many aspects that government is involved in. We'll be talking more about that later in the semester when we look at bureaucracy. I suggest that there is not a part of your life that is beyond the influence of the role of government. And we're going to spend our semester looking at just those issues and how government engages in that regulation.